Good evening. So, my name is Dexter Voisin, and I have the honor of serving as Dean here at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. I'd like to offer a warm welcome to our alumni, students, faculty, friends, and guests. And when I walked into the space, it was like a mini reunion. I heard folks saying, "Wow, I haven't seen this person in 5 years. I haven't seen this person in 7 years." So this is always a wonderful time when we can come together, reminisce, fellowship, and catch up. I'd like to take this time to tell you a bit about Herman D. Stein. And this is a name that looms large in the history and the impact of this school. Since I've had the opportunity to be a member of the Mandel School just about 3 years, it's a name that comes up frequently in so many conversations. Herman was dean of the Mandel School from 1964 to 1968. Dean Stein was a beloved leader at the Mandel School and Case Western Reserve University for many years, and he was considered a social work luminary. His life work, as you know, has focused on providing a worldwide perspective on social welfare. And as someone who came to the United States almost 40 years ago as an international student from the West Indies, global perspectives is also quite important to me. And I see folks here who have deep connections to the social work across the globe and also folks from international countries. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce his beloved daughter, Naomi Stein. She's dedicated to being here for these lectures in memory of her beloved father, who passed away in 2009. Naomi, would you please stand and be recognized? Could you please give Naomi a hand? Naomi, thank you again for participating today and for always keeping your father's memory and passion alive. You can read more about Dr. Stein and his vast contributions to international social work on the program that's at your seat. This lecture, endowed in Dean Stein's name, is designed to bring an outstanding international advocate to the Mandel School to stimulate what we know would be lively discussion, inspiring all to consider issues of community, compassion, and democracy around the world. Now, doesn't this ring true? I mean, this is a time when we are talking and we need to talk really honestly and consciously about compassion, democracy, not only in the United States, but around the world. Momentarily, I'll ask distinguished university professor emeritus, Dr. Terry Hockenstadt, our in-house and longtime world leader in social work education, and a former Mandel School dean himself, to come forward and tell you about our illustrious presenter. Now, Dr. Hockenstadt retired in 2017, and I'll say this is a small retirement, a small R, not big R, because he's always active. He keeps regular office hours, and he's continues to be a shaker and mover here at the school and in the community. And we are fortunate that he remains so dedicated to the Mandel School. And Terry, I've benefited so much from your wisdom and consultation over these past 2 years plus. So thank you so much for that. So Dr. Hockenstadt, would you please come up to the podium and introduce our illustrious speaker?
Thank you very much, Dean, for those kind words, and they certainly were very kind. It's a pleasure to be back at MSAS. I did decide when I hit my 80th birthday it was time to retire, but I haven't retired completely. I still have an office at Beaumont Hall, and it's always great to be part of MSAS gatherings. And this certainly is a very important one, which highlights the international dimension of social work education. And we're particularly fortunate to have with us one of the true leaders in international social work, Professor Lynne Healy from the University of Connecticut. You have in front of you detailed information about her many accomplishments in her long career there. but I would just like to highlight a few because I've had the pleasure of knowing Lynne for many years and working with her on international projects. She has much expertise around the world, but a particular expertise in Caribbean nations. She has been a visiting professor at the University of West Indies, worked very closely with many educators from the Caribbean. So if anybody wants to know about social work education in the Caribbean, that's one of her areas of accomplishment and expertise. She has also been a fixture of social work education at the United Nations. She has spent considerable amount of time at the United Nations, both in terms of her personal expertise and also bringing students to the United Nations. One of the times of the year I always looked forward to was Social Work Day at the United Nations and taking a group of MSAS students to New York to join Social Work Day. And of course, Lynne was there with her students as well. It continues to be an important international part of social work education. Lynne is the major representative of the International Association of Social Workers at the United Nations. So in addition to bringing students there, she has been very active in United Nations activities, and she served on a number of NGO committees at the United Nations, non-governmental organization committees at the United Nations. In addition to that work, obviously, Lynne is a scholar and has done much in the way of promoting international social work through her scholarship. Her extensive publications are too numerous to mention here, but just simply indicate that she brings both a strong advocacy and also strong scholarship. I've had the pleasure of working with her on a number of international committees and have also pleased to have her join us in Cleveland to share with you her international expertise, which obviously includes the United Nations, but is very much the International Association of Schools of Social Work. She has been an officer and very active in that role. I could say a lot more about Lynne Healy because she has a lot of wonderful dimensions, but much of that is in the written material, and I know you are here to hear her, not me. So I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Lynne Healy.
Thank you, Terry. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be welcomed by Terry Hockenstad, certainly. As you heard, we've done some various things together, a couple of publications and various meetings. He hasn't told you stories about going over the mountain in Jamaica or traveling to Kangaroo Island in Australia, but those were fun times. It's indeed an honor not only because of your school's wonderful reputation and my long association with Terry, but I also had an opportunity to meet several times Herman Stein. So that's particularly meaningful. When I was a doctoral student, I wrote my dissertation on international dimensions of social work education in the United States. And as part of the data collection, I interviewed a number of luminaries, to use that word, in international work. And one of them, of course, was Herman Stein. And so I spent probably an hour to an hour and a half with him on that occasion, and then saw him several additional times over the years, usually at birthday parties for Catherine Kendall, who is another luminary in the field. So it's wonderful, and I hope I have a chance to say hello to you later, Naomi, but this is a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to be talking, as I was encouraged to do, about the United Nations. It's probably an area that a lot of social workers don't realize that there is a social work engagement with the UN, and would be surprised to even hear that there would be a talk about social work and the UN. I'm going to talk about social work's relationship with the UN as a two-way, as the attempts of the profession to try to influence the UN itself, and also opportunities for being influenced by some of the policy initiatives that the UN has undertaken. The profession's influence on the UN can be seen both as in a historical perspective and also in terms of current roles. In the early years of the United Nations, social work was very involved. Even pre-1945, the social work profession had been active in some of the predecessor organizations, such as the International Labor Organization and the League of Nations. And there's material in the Social Welfare Archives about the IASSW, the International Association of Schools of Social Work, activities with those bodies. As the World War II was nearing its end, there was an organization of massive relief efforts. And that organization, UNRWA, provided, again, many, many opportunities for the engagement of social work expertise and social workers to actually go on the ground. And I put the name Donald Howard here because with some of my research, finding some of the things that he had done, he was the deputy head of the big relief mission in China after the war. And there's stories that he wrote about negotiating with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai about finding safe corridors to deliver aid. So not the usual social work activities. He later became a dean of one of the schools in California. The UN, after it was founded, demonstrated a lot of interest in social work as a force for development, and conducted a number of surveys of social work education, issued various declarations on the importance of social work, and in addition, there were social work professionals on the UN staff in those early days. According to Catherine Kendall, in one of the talks that she gave, she said the United Nations was unquestionably the most significant of the internationalizing influences on the social work profession, both in the United States and also throughout the world. The Economic and Social Commission issued statements urging the development of social services and social work throughout the world. And a few years later, in 1950, adopted a special resolution recognizing social work as a profession that required specialized education. So this was a big thing in terms of the profession at that point in time. Our professional associations got their beginnings back in 1928, and were mostly pretty decimated by World War II, since most of the leadership had been in Europe. So you have a fairly struggling profession, and yet the United Nations, as early as 1950, is really saying this is very important and we need to promote it. There were also social workers inside the United Nations as staff and as consultants. Many of those had come out of experience with UNRWA and brought that international expertise into the United Nations. Among them were Catherine Kendall and Eileen Younghusband, who is another big name in social work from the UK. The two of them authored, Catherine the first and Eileen the third, of what were 5 UN-sponsored surveys of social work education around the world that they did between 1950 and 1971. So over that 20-year period, great interest in social work education. Another one of the people that I interviewed when I was doing these in-depth interviews was Aida Gindi, who was a US-educated social worker from Egypt. And she spent a long period, 32 years, in the United Nations with various posts, including some high-level leadership positions. She served as chief of social welfare at headquarters And she served as regional director first in Africa for UNICEF, and then director of UNICEF for Europe. And she, in an interview that Jim Billups did with her, she talked about how to be a woman from Africa and become director of UNICEF for Europe was something that really was very impressive. And Herman Stein, as I think is in your program, he was very engaged with the United Nations and spent 20 years as a major consultant with UNICEF and consulted with 3 of their executive directors, so had major influence on policy in UNICEF. But by the 1980s, things began to change. And when I interviewed Herman Stein, one of the things he said, and I wrote down this quote because I'm a paper saver. I still have my notes from 1982. Sorry about that. As my son described to his kindergarten teacher, he said, my husband's an engineer. He said, my dad knows how to design airplanes. My mom knows how to organize paper. Herman said in the UN system, the social work flag has been lowered over the last 10 years. It is now hardly flying at all. There are many possible reasons for this. One, which I think several scholars have acknowledged, was the United Nations switched to an emphasis on social development rather than social welfare. And so the idea of social work as a lead profession was no longer true. It was a highly interdisciplinary area. Almost simultaneously in the 1970s, you can track a significant amount of diminished attention to international issues in the United States social work education. And that could be a whole other lecture, but I don't have time. And thirdly, social work has, and continues to a certain extent, kind of narrowly focused a search to define a unique role for the social work profession at the UN. And most of the UN's work is highly disciplinary. So we really have to embrace that in order to be seen as a significant player. So the more recent roles for the profession at the UN emphasize advocacy and NGO advocacy through what's called consultative status. The UN Charter, adopted obviously in 1945, made allowances for other than governments to participate in United Nations deliberations. Governments are the deciders at the UN, and we have to always, in our work with the UN, remember that. But the UN thought that maybe from time to time they would need some advice from other than governments. So they develop procedures for developing consultative status. And I always love to point out that the IASSW was granted consultative status in 1947, one of the very earliest NGOs to achieve this status. I really don't know how that came about, and I've got to try to see if anyone at the archives can find data because, again, the profession was pretty decimated at that time, so I'm not sure how the IASSW was able to pull together and apply for this status. So Terry, if you know, let me know. Our other 2 international bodies also have this consultative status, the International Federation of Social Workers and the International Council on Social Welfare. So since that time, IASSW has been active at the UN in New York at headquarters and in some selected other locations, especially Geneva. The official purpose of this consultative status is twofold. One is to enable the Council, meaning the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, to secure information and advice from organizations with special competence. And the other is to also enable these organizations to share their views of what ought to happen at the UN. So at the UN, the primary role is advocacy, fulfilling these 2 purposes. At best, it's said that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, serve as the conscience of the UN. we're actually required to keep our consultative status. We are required to be active. We are allowed to have a team of 6 people who can represent IASSW at the UN. And one of our current representatives is Dr. Sharon Milligan, who has been following issues around aging. And of course, for many years, Terry also was very active in advocacy, especially more recently around the issues of aging. I think you attended the big World Assembly on Aging, so played some very important roles there. We have the ability to attend certain UN meetings, to participate in committees with other NGOs. These are some of the areas that we are currently active in. Within certain guidelines, we're allowed to produce written statements as part of the proceedings of certain UN meetings. We can make oral statements, again, with all kinds of restrictions. We can sponsor what the UN calls side events, which are actually workshops or panels at the UN conferences. And we sometimes have opportunity to do direct advocacy with country mission representatives. If we're preparing, for example, for the Commission on Social Development, we might go meet with selected governments to encourage them to support certain aspects of issues coming before the full meeting. We have a couple of audiences. Our primary one are governments, because they are the decision makers. So if you want to influence global policy, you see your primary audience as governments. Secondarily, I think an important audience are the other non-governmental organizations that we work with to ensure that social work is visible as a partner in these relevant global concerns. And the third audience are our members and other social work, I say our, speaking for IASSW, are our members and other social work educators who need to know about what we are doing. Beginning in 2010, the international social work professional organizations developed together something called the Global Agenda for Social Work and Social Development. And the first iteration identified a series of priorities for social work globally for a 10-year period. It included local, national, and global efforts to fulfill certain principles, such as, for example, to work to reduce inequality. This document, along with the Code of Ethics, are the guides we use to decide, what we should be saying at the UN. So we're not just out there as individual free actors, but people who are there to represent social work and what social work has already prioritized. There is a new global agenda. They've been working on it sort of piecemeal. So there've been a few. There was a 2-year focus on Ubuntu, working together, a 2-year focus on building an eco-social world, and there must be a third one which is current, and I don't remember what it is. This is just giving you an example of, what do we mean by advocacy? We did a lot of work over the last few years around the topic of inequality. And that was part of our global agenda for social work, was working on inequality. IASSW wrote testimony and joined with coalitions to do some advocacy around the development of UN policies, the Agenda for Social Development that the UN launched in 2015. We're an active member of the NGO Committee for Social Development that advocates on issues relating to inequality. As part of that group, we conducted several different research studies on inequality around the world and published the results and presented those recommendations in various ways to the United Nations. We also sponsored side events at the Commission for Social Development and also at the high-level political forum that's held in the summer. And this is just a flyer showing one of those side events. I'm part of something called the Grassroots Committee of the NGO Committee on Social Development. and we attempt to secure feedback from people who are working at the grassroots around the world, because that is information that government officials do not have. So at the end of the day, does this have any influence? I think there are some examples of success. I will get into talking about the 2030 agenda shortly. There was some issues around whether a particular goal, the goal on inequality, was going to be included. And there was a lot of NGO advocacy, including from the IASSW. And because of NGO pressure, the government group did retain Goal 10. Some of the governments felt it was the same thing as a goal on poverty reduction. So the NGOs argued very forcefully that inequality is about more than income. NGOs as a group convinced the UN Commission for Social Development to adopt homelessness as the priority theme for its 2020 big full government commission session, which was the first time that the UN had ever given any official attention at that level to homelessness. Through involvements in several different NGO efforts, we've elevated the voices of girls and of people at the grassroots in UN activities. But we're certainly not always successful, and there have been a number of failures around the area of getting more visibility for mental health and for getting more visibility for human rights in the social development agenda. So I'm going to turn a bit now to talk about, I feel like maybe I'm talking too fast. I was nervous because I know we got started a little bit late, and I've given enough talks to realize that you should not cut in on reception time. You're not very welcome to do that. There are a number of areas across the United Nations where their policies and their research are very relevant for social work. And I could easily have picked to talk about human rights, which is pretty clear in terms of its relevance for social work. And there's a lot to be gained way beyond the level at which we usually talk about human rights in the UN and social work. The activities are very deep. But I think social workers are perhaps more likely to know about the human rights agenda. So I chose to talk instead about the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is a comprehensive set of policies that set out a series of an ambitious agenda, really, for social, economic, and environmental policies for a 15-year period from 2015 to 2030. It didn't come out of nowhere. It built on learnings from several past efforts. One of these was a major government summit held in 1995, the World Summit for Social Development, that was held in Copenhagen. And there actually is a plan next year to have a 30-year follow-up summit for social development. The World Summit for Social Development issued a series of commitments. It was soon overshadowed by the Millennium Development Goals, which was a set of targets that preceded what is now the 2030 Agenda. The Millennium Development Goals were they were very quickly announced. They were very top-down. The Secretariat decided these would be the plan. It was a move to try to have some results-oriented goals for UN work. They focused on goals for the developing world, not universal. But that was an important precursor because there were a lot of lessons learned out of that experience that shaped this new agenda. Another important set of agreements feeding into this process was a big conference, Rio Plus 20, a conference on the environment and on sustainability that was held in 2012. The UN loves to hold, there's Beijing plus 10, Beijing plus 30, Rio plus 20. They like to go back to themes of earlier world meetings and follow up. The negotiation of this agenda was in many ways a corrective to the MDG, Millennium Development Goal adoption. So rather than being top down, it was a long, pretty much a 2-year process of consultations, bringing in not only governments, but a space for NGOs, other kind of civil society groups, business, academics, long period of consultations. It was agreed that the outcome would define sustainable development goals and targets and be universally applicable, all countries. Final adoption of this agenda came in September of 2015. It's a very complicated set of, and detailed set of promises. There's 17 goals, in spite of the fact that the two governments chairing it thought 15 would be a nicer sounding number, but 17 it is. Each goal has a number of targets for a total of 169 targets, and each target has at least one indicator by which the UN will measure progress. Some of these are quantitative and quite specific. I have an example here. So target 3.1, 3 is the health goal. By 2030, reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 births. At the point the agenda was adopted, it was 230. So it's pretty ambitious. Other indicators, however, are vague. For example, the one on migration simply says to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration. And the only indicator is, does the government have a policy? No qualitative dimension to it. I find that many times promises get vague on issues that the UN doesn't seem to want to talk about very much. And migration is one of those. The full agenda is more than just the SDGs, but the SDGs get most of the attention. The full agenda makes a lot of lovely statements, actually, about intercultural understanding. It has more about migration than is in the goal. It has a lot more human rights language than you will see in the goals. And it talks about peace and justice. So I recommend to look at the whole document. I'm not going to read these, but this is just some examples of some quotes from the text. The one thing I added the bold text here because another important concept out of the 2030 agenda was this promise to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. This is a visual, is an icon for each goal. Some of the social work writing, there have been some articles appearing in journals, and I think we have at least 1 or 2 in the Social Work Encyclopedia have talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of those focus mostly on goals 1 through 5, although there are certainly other goals that are highly relevant for social work. But those deal with poverty, hunger, health, education, and gender equality. But goal 8 is about decent work and work opportunities. Goal 10, my favorite, reduced inequalities. And then we get into a number of goals about climate and environment. And finally, goal 16, which is a real hodgepodge. It's sort of leftover, things that were left over maybe. There's things about peace, about justice, about strong institutions. And right in the middle of it is a target about reducing child abuse. So it's an interesting goal. Put together, it's an extremely ambitious agenda for human well-being. And we have 5 more years to get there. Calls for elimination of poverty, hunger, and food insecurity, access to quality health care and education for everybody, gender equality, sustainable economic growth, clean water, urgently addressing climate change, caring for the land, modern energy, and peaceful and inclusive cities and societies. The question of universality, I think, is very important for social workers here to think about. And the whole point of this was that these targets, these goals especially, would be relevant to all countries. Within those, each country could set its own specific target, so that the goal that I mentioned on maternal mortality, in terms of reducing the global average to 70 per 100,000 live births, that doesn't make sense in countries where the rate is 20. So those countries need to set their own targets. But if you look at these targets, you see these are things that speak definitely to social problems that we have in the United States. And maybe express some of these goals and targets in ways that are useful. So that the one on poverty, for example, says to reduce by half the proportion of people living in poverty according to national definitions. So look at our poverty rate, cut that in half by 2030. Sadly, during COVID, we learned that we can do that, and then we decided it wasn't worth it. Ending hunger. 3.7 is interesting, given all the discussions that have been going on in the news. Ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information, and education. We know we're still somewhat distant from achieving universal health coverage, including financial risk protection. We have work to do on discrimination against women, against violence against women. And then here is the inequality target: to progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% that is higher than the reduction in the national average reduction in gains in income. So lots of these highly relevant right here in the U.S. Okay, so does it make a difference? It's always the question to ask. Where is the accountability structure built into this agenda? There's several different efforts. There are progress reports that are put together by UN staff through some massive data collection. The most recent was issued this summer, the Sustainable Development Goals Report 2024. And easily accessible. You don't necessarily need to know the exact website. Just Google Sustainable Development Report 2024, and it'll take you right there. There is another system called the Voluntary National Reviews. Each country is supposed to volunteer several times during this 15-year period to conduct and report on their own country's progress, and it's called a voluntary national review. These are a number of these, usually about 35, 40 of them each summer, are presented at an annual meeting called the High-Level Political Forum. Sometimes I still get a bit impressed at being part of any, even in a minor way, things at the UN. It all seems so grand. So, to do a side event at the High-Level Political Forum just seems pretty cool for social work. So these VNRs are important, and all of that data, they're all on the website. So again, you can be buried in UN data. By the way, Herman Stein thought it was essential that every social worker should learn what kind of information is available through the UN and how to access it and use it. Then there's some additional occasional reviews by the full General Assembly. You'll see that one of the problems that you can immediately see with the VNR process is that first word. They're voluntary, and they're done by the government itself. Ideally, it calls for an inclusive process so that within each country, NGOs and other actors should be able to have a part in preparing the report. Last year, 2023, there was an SDG summit in September at the halfway point. And next week, or in a few days, there's another summit, the Summit of the Future, which was something the Secretary General was very interested in. Will also do some review of progress. Progress is terrible, absolutely terrible. The SDGs will not be met. One of the problems, of course, that didn't help was COVID. COVID halted and reversed a lot of progress, and there's still areas that have not caught up. Having unexpected wars also was very problematic. For example, the invasion of Ukraine cut off the world's food supply to a lot of parts of Africa. But overall, they've currently 17% of the targets are on track to be met by 2030. And more than a third are either stagnant or have gotten worse since 2015. So it's grim. And one of the things they came out with last year at the SDG Summit was gender equality will take about 300 years to achieve at the current rate. So I don't know if any of you have that kind of time to wait. Another issue that I'm not a health expert, but I've become very interested in this issue of maternal mortality. And that's an issue, again, where there's been virtually no improvement since 2015. There have been some bright spots. Child deaths, child mortality has improved. Child marriage has declined. Previously, I think 1 in 4 girls were getting married before 18. Now it's 1 in 5. And there's been a big decrease in the number of infections, new HIV infections, and a lot more people are getting treatment. So that's been a real bright spot. So how about us? Can social work help? I've called this roles for the leave no one behind profession. At one of the social work days at the UN, Terry mentioned social work day at the UN. At one of the social work days at the UN, a speaker from the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Paul Ladd, called social work the leave no behind profession, and said that he saw social work as having the expertise, the kind of practice contact, and the value commitment to be the voice for people who are left behind. So I think that's a useful thing to think about in terms of what's our role at the UN and how can we be a key player or a player in the 2030 agenda. So in the field of practice, certainly identifying the most vulnerable and applying our expertise around the relationship of our knowledge of behavioral change to many of these goals is very important. We can also engage in policy work and advocacy at the national level across all nations to encourage program development and a focus on those left behind. And advocacy at the global level to strengthen global action and for improvement in targets and measures. I think social work would be well advised to have the most impact by focusing on areas of our expertise. One of the problems is, as social workers, we're interested in everything. But, we are not really going to be a major voice at the UN on nuclear disarmament. That doesn't mean domestically you can't advocate for it or join a peace group, but we're not going to be seen as a major voice on nuclear disarmament, or on sanitation. But that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't be involved. But we've got to, if we want to really have impact, I think we need to focus a bit more. We can certainly argue that social workers are already contributing to the SDGs. Maybe we just don't know it. But, there's a number of areas, and I've sort of played with this for something else I was writing about, what's social work already doing? Well, we help people find employment, SDG 8. We address kids' problems in schools to help them learn better and finish school, SDG 4, and so on. So there are many areas in which we're already engaged in work on this agenda. And these could probably be strengthened by practicing with some increased awareness of the SDGs and building on our expertise, especially our expertise in human behavior to address issues ranging from gender equality, women's health, to sanitation practice, to compliance with disease protocols. A lot of these have to do with human behavior. At dinner last night, one of your professors, David Miller, if I got the name right, yeah, was talking about engagement with the School of Engineering, and again, merging social work knowledge with engineering initiatives. So I came back to maternal mortality as an example, and wanted to bring it home, because this is becoming somewhat of a crisis in the United States. Our maternal mortality ratio, last number I saw published, was 21 per 100,000 births. In Norway and Poland, it's 2. And if you look at the country ranks, going from worst to best, the best being the 185th country that they have data for, we ranked 122nd. We are way down the list. You'd be shocked at the countries that are ahead of us. And this has been increasing significantly since 2015. And it's only going to get worse, because there's a little bit of data already coming out of Texas on the impact of the repeal of Roe v. Wade and what that's doing in terms of the inability of women to get the care they need for problem pregnancies. So we're definitely going to see probably an even worse rate than we have now. And why does social work? The causes across the world, including in the U.S., go beyond health care. Accessibility to prenatal care is important, but it alone does not fully address maternal mortality. A lot of it has to do with living conditions here and internationally, poverty, domestic violence, lack of trust in healthcare systems, racism and inappropriate cultural practices, and a lack of sensitivity among health providers. These are things that fall in our laps as social workers. It was interesting. I attended a wonderful session at the UN a couple of years ago from Kenya, where they had both government people and NGOs speaking. Their ratio as a country is over 500, and in one particular province, it's close to 1,000, and it's the area near the Somali border. And again, recognizing that it really was, there was some problems with lack of health care, but that was even where there was health care available. Women weren't taking advantage of it. So they needed to intervene with families, with village leaders, with Muslim clerics to try to address the issue. In the arena of advocacy, I just picked on mental health because the SDGs are extremely weak in the area of mental health. There's a target in the health goal. It says more than this. It gets even worse, more muddy. But at one point it says to reduce mortality from non-communicable disease and promote mental health. The only indicator is suicide rate. It's not very helpful because mental health services are limited or absent in a number of countries. It would have been much better to have a non-quantitative indicator that encouraged countries to actually develop mental health services. So I think there are many roles for social work globally to develop services, to combat stigma, and to pressure governments and the UN to provide more leadership. Each country was supposed to refine its own targets. Certainly here, as well as abroad, we need to advocate for more government attention and funding for improved social protections. Another arena that is national are migration policies. They are set at the national level. So social workers, again, and I know social workers are very active on this, can press for more humane policies on refugee admission and on treatment of refugees and immigrants. And the current campaign is putting these issues into very stark perspective in terms of what we have to look forward to. We also can look for ways as social workers to participate in the voluntary national review process and in human rights treaty reviews that are related to the SDGs. I could say more about that, but I don't have time. And especially here, we need to accept as part of our responsibility simply as citizens, and even more so perhaps as educated citizens, to monitor the actions and the statements of our own government at the United Nations and to lobby members of the Senate that set our foreign policy. One of the realities for us, I said in the last slide that we should participate in the VNR process. Well, the United States functions at the United Nations often as a critical observer in the social and human rights arenas, very active in the political and security decisions of the UN, dominant in many ways. But when it comes to the social agenda, the human rights agenda, at times the administrations have been critical. At other times, they're simply an observer. They don't participate. We have, as many of you know, a pattern of non-ratification of treaties, and therefore we don't participate in the implementation of those treaties. There has been no, I had to look this up last week to make sure I wasn't saying the wrong thing, but I'm convinced now this is correct. There's been no official domestic response to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're one of only 3 countries that has never completed or asked or volunteered to do a voluntary national review. The other 2 are Haiti and Myanmar. You can, if you look up U.S. government position on the 2030 agenda and on the SDGs, you will find some material, but it's all about our role as a giver of foreign assistance and how our foreign assistance helps other countries address the SDGs. And again, you'd see no evidence of any impact on domestic policy. Found a good article by a guy named Tony Pippa from the Brookings Institute. He said that the high point for the U.S. regarding the 2030 agenda was when it was adopted. President Obama very early on made a commitment at its adoption and said that we would, we endorsed the agenda and gave a lovely speech. But there is no linkage in our government structure between domestic policy and foreign policy. Just interesting. Said under the next administration, under Trump administration, there was absolutely no action or discussion of the social development agenda. And in general, the stance of that administration toward the UN was marked probably more by hostility than by simply non-engagement when it came to the social and economic. You may remember, if any of you watched the inaugural speech to the UN made by the president, his big pronouncement was globalism is dead. So, this obviously meant we were not going to engage. Pippa also points out that Joe Biden failed to capitalize on a very obvious fit between his own domestic agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And he recommended that at least there needed to be a kind of a cabinet level committee if the U.S. was going to get more engaged domestically on tying this agenda to us. There was an article in 2020 that said the 2030 agenda, tinkering or transformation, because the title of the agenda was transforming. In spite of its many limitations, the 2030 agenda will continue to be a dominant theme in global social policy conversations till the end of the decade. And probably fairly soon, in a couple of years, we'll start talking about what comes next. There's a need for a huge recommitment and new financing to begin to even come close to meeting that agenda. And that was very clear at the SDG summit that was held. Flexibility will be needed, and I think this is probably as true with many policies. There was a failure to see that things will go wrong. I mean, nobody was expecting a global pandemic of the scale of COVID-19. I remember my son saying, "Mom, I can't believe this has never happened before in your lifetime." They love to remind you how old you are. But that is an important, that there may be other things coming down the pike. Nobody, very few people expected that Russia would actually invade Ukraine and that we would have a war that's gone on for more than 2 years. So there will be other crises, including frequent natural disasters. We could call for more accountability, but I've always been aware, since I studied a lot of social planning in my MSW program, that accountability is important, but it's also very expensive. It requires a lot of expertise. It requires a lot of money. So ultimately, will SDGs make a difference? This is something I wrote, a lot of years ago. 2017, I was already predicting trouble, saying that, as in all UN plans, the success will depend largely on country-level commitments and action, with some help from international partnerships and foreign aid. Government buy-in is essential. Political will often is lacking, and that is really the essential ingredient in all of these policies. And finally, challenges for social work. We need to try to increase our profession's representation. We have major limitations in resources, both human. For IASSW, for example, we're all volunteers that do this work at the UN. And there's very limited funds in order to allow us to participate at the level that some other NGOs are able to participate. We have no funds, for example, for any of our people who do the representation to travel to any of the world meetings that are held anywhere other than in New York. And everybody pays their own way to commute into New York. One way to do this would be to recruit more people to assist in terms of helping with writing expert statements, but that also has complications in terms of how do you bring more people in as volunteers and still ensure that everybody is speaking for the organization. A few of those things I said before, but again, also I hope that we need the U.S. to be more supportive of the work of the international professional associations. Very few schools of social work in the United States belong to the IASSW. It's one of the causes of our resource problems. And it's really unfortunate that we don't kind of do our part. Is American social work just like the U.S. at the UN? Are we critical observers instead of real participants? And finally, in case Western has done a nice job of this, we need to educate a newer generation of internationalists to continue to move us forward. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope it's been helpful.
At this time, we will now open the floor for questions and answers. So if you do have a question, we ask that you raise your hands, and I will come bring the microphone to you for Dr. Healy to hear.
question. I'm a member of the NGO Committee on Aging at the United Nations, and I'm wondering how much, in terms of implementation, citizens can be involved through this route, as obviously as well as the government. I understand the governments have to be involved, but these non-governmental organization committees at the United Nations, could you say a little bit about them?
In terms of how people can get involved? Is that in terms of involvement?
Yeah, and in terms of moving the agenda forward through through non-governmental organizations.
Do you mind if I sit down? My back's kind of had enough standing in one place. Whoops. Well, I think in many ways it is NGOs on the ground that largely are moving the agenda forward. I think that's who does the real work. It's really organizations at the local level that advance a lot of these goals. In terms of the advocacy function, that's primarily what our NGO groups do, is advocacy to try to encourage the UN to be more active in actually implementing the plans that are made and to call for increased accountability for moving us forward. There probably are some additional opportunities for people to get more involved in this work because of COVID. A lot of this work has now gone virtual. So some of the NGO committees are meeting only virtual, and some of them are meeting in hybrid function. So on the social development group that I'm part of, we now have members in Nigeria and other parts of the world, in Germany, I think. So it is possible to become more involved. To become involved as an official representative of an organization, you of course have to go through that organization. So to represent IASSW, you would have to get sort of anointed by IASSW. But a lot of these allow people to participate in the meetings without being an official representative from an accredited body. So there are some opportunities for that. Our volunteers, by the way, are social work educators. Most of them, except for Sharon, are clustered near New York. I'm about 3¼ hours away, so I guess that's near enough, but it's not right there. But they're from schools like Rutgers, Fordham, Hunter. I think those are the main ones who are involved in this work. So I think there are opportunities to do that. And I'll put on my slide that Terry mentioned Social Work Day at the UN. Historically, we have had a day in the spring that focused on social work and was held at the UN headquarters. And hopefully that will be revived this year. Last year, we were unable to hold it for bureaucratic reasons at the UN. So hopefully that will happen. It would happen in March or very early April while the semester is still underway, because the primary audience is usually students. Yes. And here's some other experts.
Hi, I'm Pat Brownell, and I'm a emerita professor from Fordham University, living in Cleveland now. And at the School of Social Work there, we've developed a student unit. And again, because of the many virtual meeting opportunities there are now since COVID, we have right now through Elaine Congress, my colleague there, 8 students now in a unit that are placed with NGOs and attend meetings. We've got one student with the NGO Committee on Aging. And the students, the social work students, are getting a great opportunity to experience the UN and really make a contribution to the NGO community.
Great idea. Great example.
Comment. My name is Jim Collins. I lived in New York until 2015, While there, I was with the NGO Committee on Aging as the General Assembly negotiated the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd just like to point out that was 190 nations agreeing on common language. That document had to get the agreement of all the countries. And that it brought together for the first time economic, social, environmental issues into one document and showing the interrelationships among them all. This was a great progress for the UN. Now, as Lynn pointed out, U.S. is doing a miserable job of following up. On the other hand, there has been activity at the local level. I know, for example, I think it's Orlando, the city government, they looked at these sustainable development goals, said, hey, let's think about the development of our budget and our goals and look at all of these. And they were using that to help them do a better government. So they are useful. They are useful.
Thank you for raising that about the language and the agreement, because, you know, there's two sides to this, and the same is true with the human rights treaties. You know, it's amazing. All these governments from all over the world come together and agree on these principles. So even though the implementation is disappointing to us, it is remarkable that you get those governments together and can agree on what we would like to see for the world is in the future.
Hello, I'm Dorothy Fowler, a graduate of this place and very active in the Cleveland International Program. I think I know many of you in this room. I was very impressed with your talk, Lynn. And one of the things I've been pondering a lot about lately is population growth. And does the UN ever talk about this big issue? And ever, it's not a goal to reduce our population in the world, is it? And maybe we can have some discussion about that.
There actually, there's a commission on population, yeah, and there's been a couple of world conferences on it. I mean, my sense in the U.S. as well is that we used to have a lot of conversation about it. There was ZPG, zero population growth. I mean, one observation that I would make is in some areas it's happening anyway. There does seem to be a natural occurring reduction of population in many places, sometimes to an alarming degree, as in Japan. But in a lot of developing countries too, where the average family size used to be 8 children, you know, it's down to 4 children. And so, you know, I think there has been less, if I'm wrong, please somebody jump in, because I certainly am not an expert on all these areas. But it's interesting, even domestically, we don't hear much talk about reducing the population like we used to. And yet it's closely linked to the environmental agenda. So it's kind of strange that we don't talk more about that.
Hi, can you hear me okay with the mask? Okay. I'm Catherine Lewis. I'm a alumnus here. I also work at the Big Gun Center upstairs, and I'm also a PhD student in the history of social work. I would love to draw us back. Yeah, I would love to draw us back to your dissertation. And I want just your reflections on, if you have those conversations today, do you feel anything's changed in the impact of international, ism on social work education today?
I think it has. Well, I think it's been like this kind of a lot of activity, as I mentioned, in the 40s and 50s, and then a turning away for, I think, various societal reasons, as well as social work reasons in the 70s and 80s. you can actually track some of this if you look at the curriculum policy statements that the Council on Social Work Education issued. Some of the early ones call for international content. Then absolutely silent on it in the 80s and 90s. Finally, one real general statement. I'm such a nerd, I read curriculum policy statements. Finally, one very weak statement in 2000, and now back up again, where we talk about international content, human rights content. So I think there's clearly been an explosion of literature. When I wrote the first edition of my textbook on international social work, I had a hard time finding a publisher because some of the publishers said, you're writing about something that doesn't exist. No one will be interested. Fortunately, my number one choice of a publisher, Oxford, was interested. So, but it was interesting that, it was hard to even know. They said, no one would be interested in this. So I think we've definitely seen, there's just tons of literature out there now. And I think there's a lot more interest. Still got a ways to go, but I think the historical view is very interesting. I love history.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Yoon Kyung Shin. I'm a doctoral student here at AMSAS, and I was a UN staff with the United Nations Development Program in Uganda, and then I was a social worker from South Korea, and then hired to go to UN missions. And I found that it was very difficult because, as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, it is a highly interdisciplinary team. Sure. I will yell it. Should I start again? Or yes. So I'm a doctoral student here at AMSAS, and I was a UN staff with the UNDP Uganda country office. I was in a space of displacement work because when I was there, it was a time when South Sudanese refugees were coming to Ugandan border. So, and I was trying to tell you that when I was there, it was actually was difficult to understand why people don't understand social work language in the highly interdisciplinary team, where team of economists or rule of law experts, they're like lawyers, and then they don't understand my lingo. When the problem we are trying to solve is highly it requires social work problem solving skills. So it was a really, I felt it at a field location, what you said about that the social work profession were not really recognized, and it is really deeply felt in field locations as well. So thank you again.
Thank you. That's a good example. Yeah, the interdisciplinary part it can be really exciting. I mean, you can bring so many disciplines to bear on a problem, but it's hard to get the voice of social work. I think the thing to do is to speak from our expertise without trying to, raise the flag, even though I'm sure Herman would want the flag to be flying. But to say, well, I'm a social worker and you should be paying attention to us. To say, talk about, the human, I'm sure that's not what you were doing, but, to talk about the human dimensions of solving issues and, how you get people to accept certain kinds of changes, how you help, if you open a health clinic, you need to talk with the families about using the health clinic. And, that piece of bringing professions together to work on those issues, I think, is critical. So. Mm-hmm. Did you hear her? She said when she was able to get social work language at the country mission level, in a country project level in Uganda where she could get some of that into UN documents, it was very well received by governments at the local level. And she said that, she found in UNICEF, for example, more like-minded people who understood some of these dimensions that social workers were working on. So yeah, it depends on the organization in terms of how used they are to working with social workers. But we have to face the fact that our profession has been largely absent inside the UN from the staff level. So therefore, it's a challenge for those who venture in terms of making their impact felt.
Question, but we do encourage you to keep the conversation going as we enter our reception. But we do have time for one more question. I'll put it in the middle.
So my name is Shatabi. I work here as a senior research associate at the Begun Center upstairs. One of the questions I have, and I worked for the UNICEF in India and worked on some UN projects. I also have a master's degree in human rights. One thing that I have felt across the board coming to America for my graduate studies is generally students in social science are less aware of the UN and what the UN does and its functionaries, as my counterparts in Europe or England are much more aware of how the UN functions. I guess that to kind of see the thread from what you said, the emphasis from the government being not there for the UN doesn't lead to, therefore, education in the social sciences regarding the UN would be my feeling. The second point I wanted to make, and this may be a goofball question for you, but given the status of the UN Security Council, especially with the two wars and the antagonism regarding two voting members with the rest of the three, how do you think that agenda affects the UN 17's SDGs when it comes to reporting and sorting out and moving on to additional agenda from the 2030 agenda?
I mean, the UN was originally, I think, founded to deal with security issues and peacekeeping. Obviously, it hasn't done very well in that agenda. And that's an area where I'm clearly not an expert. But I think if you learned one thing in earlier education as a U.S. citizen about the UN, you probably did know that there are permanent members of the Security Council and that those permanent members tend to disagree to the extent that all the important resolutions that come before the Security Council are vetoed. So it's a stalemate in terms of real security agreements among the governments. So, sometimes it's the U.S. that's the veto. Other times it's usually China and Russia that are the vetoes. So, we have this dilemma. There's a lot of push at the UN by developing countries to say we deserve some permanent seats, but it's not, those who have the permanent seats are not likely to vote for that. So I think that's definitely a challenge.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Healy for traveling all the way from Connecticut to present with us today. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Healy? Now, some persons in this room might recall when this Northeast area was known as Connecticut Western Reserve. And Dr. Healy has been to dozens and dozens of international countries, but this is her first visit to Ohio. So we are so honored that you came and you brought your wealth of knowledge, information, and also the impact that you and so many others have been doing in this field. So I'm going to invite folks now to join us for the reception. You can grab a hold of Dr. Healy, ask some more questions. And if you're not receiving our Action magazine, that means you're not on our mailing list. And we'd love to keep you abreast of really dynamic programming like this and others. So please see a member of our development team. If you'd like to get members of the development team, just lift your hands. You'd like to get on our mailing list, please, and continue to enjoy the evening. Thank you again so much for your participation.